Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on Zero Trust Security. My name is Sanjeev Verma and I'm a co-founder of PreVeil. It's 2021 and one fact is abundantly clear that the very best protected systems can be breached. In 2020, as is well known, nation-state actors breached US government networks by exploiting vulnerabilities in the SolarWinds software. The Associated Press reported that hackers gained access to email accounts, including the head of the Department of Homeland Security and members of the department's cybersecurity staff whose job it was to hunt threats from foreign countries. A global wave of cyber attacks and data breaches resumed in January 2021, impacting this time on-premise Microsoft Exchange servers, giving attackers full access to user emails and passwords on affected servers, admin privileges on the servers, and access to connected devices on the same network. It's estimated that 250,000 servers fell victim to the attacks, including about 30,000 in the United States, 7,000 in UK, and the European Banking Authority, the Norwegian Parliament, and Chile's Commission for Financial Markets. In response, on February 25th, the National Security Agency, which possesses arguably the world's most sophisticated cybersecurity capabilities, strongly called for the adoption of zero trust systems, especially for the defense industrial base. In today's webinar, our distinguished panel will provide us with a clear understanding of the cybersecurity threat landscape. What's zero trust cybersecurity? Why is it necessary? How is it different to existing and traditional approaches, and how can zero trust impact the defense industrial base's security via the CMMC program? Our guests today include Glenn Gerstell. Glenn was the former General Counsel of the National Security Agency from 2015 to 2020. He has had a very distinguished career in both law as the managing partner of Milbank and in government. I often like to think that if I was ever stranded on an island, he would be my top choice to be my companion because of the stories that he'd have to tell. But then I changed my mind because I'm pretty sure he wouldn't tell me anything. Our next guest is Raluca Popa. She's a professor of computer security at UC Berkeley, co-founder of PreVeil, widely considered to be one of the world's top computer security researchers. She was picked to be MIT's top 35 innovators under 35 list for cybersecurity. And I believe that Zuckerberg and Google's founders will find that they are in good company because that's the award that they received. And finally, we have Lieutenant General Ed Cardon, who had a very distinguished 37-year career in the armed forces and was commander of the United States Army's Cyber Command. So welcome everybody, and we're looking forward to a great discussion over here. So let me start with a definition of zero trust that the NSA provided. According to the NSA, a zero trust model eliminates trust in any one element, node, or service by assuming that a breach is inevitable or has already occurred. The model further limits access and looks for anomalous malicious activity. So let me start first with you, Glenn. Can you provide us an understanding of the threats landscape? Why is this zero trust business at all needed? What are the adversaries, their objectives?
Sure, Sanjeev. So thank you. And first, if we indeed were on a desert island together, as you just suggested, I'd waive my zero trust principle and it would tell you everything, so don't worry about that. And I'm delighted to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues as Ed and Raluca. So to your question, you know, Sanjeev, you've just said it all in your opening introduction. We all know what the threat landscape looks like from newspaper headlines. Our cyber lives are rife with reports of attacks, hacks, ransomware, et cetera. So that's the current situation. What's the future look like? And for me, as I think about it, 2 points come out of that. They're obvious, but like many obvious points, they're worth repeating. And indeed, they're really the foundation of our discussion for zero trust. So in terms of the future, just last week, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence issued, as it does every 4 years, their Global Trends Report. It's absolutely fascinating. And those of you who are interested in a deeper dive into it, I recommend you download it. It's an unclassified document called Global Trends 2040. And it has a number of scenarios as to what the future might look like. Almost all of those scenarios that they paint have one thing in common, which is continued cyber insecurity as the attack surface, so to speak, gets bigger and technology continues to evolve. In other words, with the Internet of Things talking about potentially trillions of interconnected devices by the year 2040 and increases in technological sophistication, we are going to see continued cyber insecurity. I suspect that at tomorrow's hearings and the next day's hearings before the Senate and House on the annual threats hearings, the leaders of our nation's spy agencies will once again, as they have for the past several years, say that the number one threat we face is cyber. If it isn't number one, it's probably going to be number 2 or 3. So that's my first point, which is to say that simply that our cyber vulnerabilities are probably going to get worse before they get better. This is not something that's behind us. When I was at the National Security Agency until fairly recently, there were 4 countries in particular that we focused on: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They all use cyber as a weapon. They have different strategies and tactics. We don't have to go into too much detail now, but North Korea is very interested in trying to use cyber for financial reasons to prop up their economy. Russia's a little more interested in disinformation and wreaking havoc generally. China presents perhaps the most dangerous, pernicious threat long-term because of their theft of intellectual property. They're scooping up vast personal details about us and possibly, just possibly, doing reconnaissance and implanting malware that might one day be useful if ever, God forbid, we had a real cyber war. So we've got several countries that are very sophisticated. The barriers to entry in this are getting lower, so probably in a few years, it won't be just these 4. So that's the first point, which is the problem is probably going to get worse before it gets better. Obvious, but still significant. And second, very quickly, one thing that SolarWinds and the Hafnium recent attacks show us is that despite our best efforts, chances are a persistent, sophisticated attacker will always get through, at least initially. It's very hard. We saw how they penetrated the federal government's Einstein system into 9 federal governments and agencies, and as you said, Sanjeev, many, many customers. And so I think you have to assume that a sophisticated cyber adversary is going to get through. But as the SolarWinds attack also showed us, not every victim who was penetrated suffered severe consequences. Not everyone's emails were read. And that's because they had internal processes that stopped the attacker in their tracks, so to speak. There may be an initial penetration. And that's sort of what zero trust is about, which is to assume that someone could get in, and then it's all about how you deal with the fact that once someone is suspected of being in your system, what privileges, what access, what emails can they look at, and that's what zero trust is getting at.
Thanks very much for setting the stage, and I'll add to this by asking Raluca that many perceive that our tech giants, Microsoft and Google in particularly, are massive companies, and indeed they are, and that they'll protect us from cyber threats because we use systems from them. But in the wake of the SolarWinds attack, Microsoft's president Brad Smith noted in a CNN interview that likely over 1,000 engineers developed the code to mount the SolarWinds attack, again underscoring the points that Glenn just made. And that's a number that's perhaps greater than the developers on Microsoft's popular email and file sharing systems that most in corporate America and the world use. But more fundamentally, the security approach that these existing systems take is based on a perimeter security approach and not zero trust. So can you describe for the audience, what are the core technology principles of zero trust, and how do they differ from what exists right now in legacy systems?
Indeed. Thank you, Sanjeev, and also honored to be on this wonderful panel. As both of you have said, attacks, cyber breaches are relentless, and they will continue happening because the existing legacy security mechanisms are fundamentally weak. So the best way I can explain this is to actually illustrate it really fast by sharing a very simple graphic here of how that is happening, okay? Basically, here you see a server with a lot of data. Consider it's the Facebook server or Microsoft or Google. They accumulate a lot of user data. Now, the way they protect it today is by building taller and taller software walls around it. This is what legacy security mechanisms do. Now, the problem with software is that it's complex and it always has bugs. It will always have bugs. And the attackers will eventually exploit those bugs and get access to the sensitive data. So no matter what these tech giants do, there will always be bugs that attackers will exploit. So fundamentally, the approach of just building walls around the data is insufficient and weak. Instead, Zero Trust says, assume that the attacker will get access to the servers and will breach and steal the data. Assume that will happen. Then make sure that it cannot access all the data or it has very limited access to what it can steal. Basically, that's the difference in thinking in Zero Trust. It's the idea that you must be prepared for an attack happening and to make sure that there is no central point of attack.
Appreciate that, Raluca. That's a very clear, understanding of how these systems, differ, and adds to the comments that Glenn just made about, the attack is inevitable, but then the security systems can kick in. And I kind of tend to think of it in the COVID analogy, something like this, that, masks are the perimeter security approach. They try to keep the virus at bay. But a zero trust system is sort of akin to the vaccine, that, it assumes that the virus is going to get to you. And so systems kick in that protect you in the event that happens.
Absolutely.
So let's get back to Glenn. Glenn, let's not wait for the island to divulge a lot, but could you, for the audience, provide some perspective on the evolution of zero trust systems? You've seen them evolve in your tenure at the National Security Agency. Why are these systems necessary, and share with us, how they came about?
Sure, Sanjeev. So actually, zero trust may be a sort of relatively new word, but the concept itself isn't all that new. And let me explain a little bit. From the National Security Agency's point of view, it has one very significant responsibility under statute. We're all very familiar with its responsibilities for doing foreign intelligence surveillance, but it has an equally important mission under the statutes for the past 60-odd years, 70-odd years, which is to be responsible for what's called national security systems. That's a defined term, but basically it includes everything that we think of as the military's computer systems and communication systems, weapons systems, command and control systems for weapons, as well as classified networks that are in the hands of defense contractors. And we all know there are many, many thousands of defense contractors, big and small. So NSA is responsible for, in effect, the security policies, not operating them, but the security policies for all of those systems. And as a result of that experience, both defending it as well as its offensive mission of finding out how to get into foreign countries' systems where appropriate, the National Security Agency developed years ago in coordination with DISA, a unit of the Department of Defense, the so-called black core concept. This goes back almost to 2003 and 4, where there was an emphasis on, to use a horrible word, deperimeterization, meaning trying to get rid of, as Luca just explained, this idea that we'll build a moat around the castle, and if we really have a good moat and a good wall, that'll be sufficient. Getting away from that concept and moving to one where we look at it, trusting individual transactions and authenticating individual transactions, and saying, to use my castle metaphor just a minute ago, just because someone's inside the castle doesn't necessarily mean they can be trusted to go anywhere to visit the king or the storeroom or whatever. You get the analogy. John Kindervag is sort of one of the people who's credited with popularizing the zero trust term. Moving fast forward, the National Security Agency works hand in hand with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which just this past August published the NST 800-207, which is a 30 or 40 page monograph on zero trust architecture. And again, worth reading for those in your audience. Again, that's the NIST 800-207, which came out in August of this year. So for this reason, mainly the National Security Agency's responsibility for protecting and providing policies for defense contractors, the NSA recently issued its zero trust guidance. Technically, it applies just to the defense agencies, but of course, we all know that in this case, the security principles used for defense contractors can also be applied to the general public.
That's fascinating. So I think you made a very important point, Glenn, on the role that the NSA has to protect the national defense networks. And I think this is a good segue to Ed. General, the very nature of warfare is changing from one largely based on the battlefield. We've all assumed that there are soldiers with great many weapons that are taking on the battlefield, but now the battlefield, it appears to include now cyber. You headed up the U.S. Army Cyber Command. Can you provide, from your vantage point, some insights into the role of cyber and the role zero trust plays in the overall security posture of the defense forces?
Sure, and thanks, Sanjeev, and it's great to be with everyone here on the panel. So in 2010, the Department of Defense identified cyber as another domain of warfare. Now, up to that time, we just had land, sea, and air. Now there's cyber, and more recently, space has been added. Why? Is because it's been recognized it's competitive space with all the offensive and defensive components we would expect in the other domains. What's a little different here is the cyber also affects all the other domains as well. So, it's very possible that some of our systems in those other domains could have problems with cyber attacks. So for the defense, when you think about the way normally we organize the systems, and Glenn talked about the intelligence systems and then the tactical systems, including the platforms, and then we have enterprise systems and we have business systems, but underneath all that sits this massive defense industrial base. And after thinking about solar winds, we might have to think a little bit differently about how we think about conventional war, as you alluded to, Sanjeev, right away, which is, it's traditionally looked at in terms of the services. But in this case, cyber has come into its other element. But to Raluca's comments, for years we've depended on, if we can just protect the transport, we'll be okay. Build the walls, perimeter defense, etc. Except recent events, which have already been outlined here, show the importance of securing the data. And now the real prize is the data itself, especially when you start thinking about defensive platforms. So it now comes down to trust. And being in the operational, you're wondering a couple things when you get data. And we have this problem all the time, is the data you're getting, can it be trusted? Is it right? And so if you start with no one knows all hardware, no one knows all hardware, everything can be hacked, then maybe we need a different approach. And as Glenn laid out, that different approach appears to be zero trust, which starts with the assumption that your network will be hacked. And what are you doing to protect your data? And so if we can protect the data through authentication, segmentation, encryption, and they're in there and that data can still be passed and we can still operate.
Sanjeev, you're muted.
Sanjeev, it's...
Sorry. General, thank you. You've, I think, articulated that the cyber readiness is no longer the sole responsibility of the armed forces, because it's inextricably linked, it appears, to the cyber preparation and readiness of the defense industrial base. So I'd like your thoughts on the role that zero trust should play, perhaps as part of the upcoming CMMC program, because there's a major program that's underway that is ostensibly geared towards a substantive, increase in the overall readiness and cybersecurity of the defense industrial base. I think the audience would appreciate your thoughts on, what role should Zero Trust be playing in the context of CMMC?
First, if I could expand out a little bit, it's just not the defense industrial base, right? There's critical infrastructures for the United States, and then critical defense infrastructures, and then you have the defense industrial base. And I think all of them, there's great merit in adopting the Zero Trust for the very reason that we highlighted. If you can't protect the hardware and you can't protect the software because of the inherent vulnerabilities, and we all know that most breaches start with human error, then you put all three of those together against a determined adversary, you're going to lose. So what would you do to better protect us? And this is what started the cyber maturity model, with the idea of the other NIST framework, which is being used now, 800-172, which just came out recently, which highlights a series of steps that could be done. But that is, when you look at that, that is actually written more for the past, not totally, but I'm going to be out on a little bit of a limb here, because if you have Zero Trust, a lot of those automatically are accepted. There's no problem with them. And so if you start going to start moving more to Zero Trust, by its very nature, it's more secure.
I do think you make a good point over here. We've always felt that, this is a historic opportunity with the CMMC program, where there will be a fundamental upgrade of the basic communication systems. And it affords an opportunity to recognize, what is the threat landscape that, Glenn and you have articulated, and what we know now as best principles in cybersecurity, and kind of bring them into the defense posture for the defense industrial base and critical networks, which is really what the NSA was explicitly saying in its guidance. So moving on, I'd like to get, Raluca, your perspective in a little bit more technical detail on Zero Trust. So far we have talked about the general principles of Zero Trust, but as the SolarWinds and the Exchange server attacks demonstrated, and the data is pretty clear, that the number one target of attackers is communication systems. That's always what they want to do. And more specifically, emails and files is what they're after. And the existing email and file sharing systems have three components. They are users that use the systems, servers where the information is stored and forwarded, and admins who have access to it for administrative purposes. Can you describe how Zero Trust systems approach security for servers and users and admins, and contrast that with the kind of legacy or perimeter-based systems? And I recognize again that there are a great many technical experts over here, but I would appreciate you making these complex topics accessible to the general audience over here. So let's go step by step. Let's talk about the server first, passwords, admins, and then how do you limit trust even when you're in the system?
Sounds good, indeed. So as Sanjeev is saying, there's all these three components: the server, the users, and admin, and one has to provide Zero Trust with respect to each one of these. So let's start with the server, right? We hear about server breaches all the time. The Facebook breach this year, 500 million users exploited from the servers, Microsoft Exchange server and SolarWinds. So again, because I'm more academic here, I really like to show you a slide for the server side. So I would say very, very effective method against removing the server from this trust, from this central point of trust, is end-to-end encryption. The way end-to-end encryption works is that a sender, let's say on company A, is going to encrypt an email on the sender's device on the laptop and send the email encrypted to recipients, which could be in company B, C, or D. So they receive the email encrypted and they decrypt it and read it. Now, the important crucial point here is that the server only received encrypted data. The server does not have the ability to decrypt it, so the data looks like junk, it's random. The reason this is super useful is that if an attacker breaks in, which is gonna happen, with zero trust, it's gonna happen, they're only gonna look and see encrypted data. They're not gonna be able to know what's underneath that data. The only people who can decrypt the data, an email, let's say, it's the sender and the receiver. So if the attacker were to go after the sender, it could maybe get the sender's data, but is not going to get the other user's data. So there you go, you removed, from trust, the server, which had access to all the emails in a legacy system, and now the server only has access to encrypted emails. And if you go after each user in part, you can only get that user's email. You can no longer get the aggregation of all the emails of all the users. So that's a very, very, very powerful mechanism, end-to-end encryption. So that was on the server side. Now, on the user side, a very important mechanism is to think about, okay, how are users authenticating, how are users accessing the data? Well, today, passwords are a very common tool. The problem with passwords is we know that they are very easy to guess. In fact, a lot of common passwords the survey showed are, work, job, God, 1, 2, 3. So they're very, very easy to guess. Instead, you should be unguessable. So using cryptographic keys instead that are stored in the user's device is much, much more secure because those are so large and have so much randomness that they cannot be guessed. In fact, there are more such keys than there are atoms in the universe. Now, the administrator. So the administrator has been hacked in many situations, and administrators tend to have access to all the data in a legacy system. So they are a central point of attack, and they are a place where zero trust traditionally is broken. So it is important, in order to provide zero trust, is to make sure that no administrator can have access to all the data in a system. And ideally, you can distribute the trust, which can be done via, for example, cryptographic mechanisms that distribute the trust among, let's say, a few administrators. And I would say the analogy there are nuclear launch codes, where a few administrators have to come together before they can access all the data in the system. Now, another very important, I would say, tool for zero trust is also connected to authentication, is how do users know that they're receiving email from a correct user? And there you can try to build trusted communities by verifying the identity of users, again, through various cryptographic mechanisms. So I would say this is a map of the state-of-the-art mechanisms one can use to have zero trust at all of these components.
Well, thanks, Raluca. And again, that was quite clear, but I gotta say that, in many communications, including with some of the top CIOs and CISOs, I run into one of the most popular misconceptions in cybersecurity. You had articulated that, look, there's a server, there's end-to-end encryption. And what I'm most often told is that people assume that if the server has encryption in transit and encryption at rest, then it's secure because, well, it's encryption and it's encrypted in transit and it's encrypted at rest, therefore it's secure. And again, the Microsoft Exchange servers that were breached and other servers that are attacked certainly encrypt in transit and at rest. Then how is it that they are compromised? Could you again clarify one more time? How is end-to-end encryption different from encryption in transit and rest? And perhaps shed light on why the NSA says, the #1 recommendation for secure collaboration or communication is to ensure that the system has end-to-end encryption. So appreciate some thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So it's very important in security to think of the weakest link. So you take the email communication from the sender to the server, some processing inside the server, and then to the receiver. And if there's any weak link anywhere there, the attacker is going to go after it. So now let's see what's happening. With encryption in transit, the encryption is from the sender to the server, but the server gets the email decrypted. So the encryption is only on the network, on the communication between the user and the server, but the server gets to see the email. Now, encryption in storage is at rest, happens after the server processed that email, did what it had to do with it, and it puts it in storage for later. It encrypts it while it's at rest, but it's only encrypted at rest. For example, that's useful if somebody comes in a data center and steals the disks, but that's such an obsolete attack. It's not, a very real concern. The biggest concern is hackers breaking into the server while the server is processing the data. And that's where the data is decrypted. It's accessible because that is not encryption in transit. In transit was only over the network, and that is not encryption at rest. That was only in storage. In traditional systems, the data is decrypted and accessible at that point because neither encryption in transit or at rest cover it. And that's called, in use, right? That's the data in use. The nice thing about end-to-end encryption is that the whole pipeline is encrypted, including when the data is in use. So you have in transit, in use, and in storage at rest. It's encrypted all throughout. So there isn't a link, a place where the attacker can break in and find the data in an encrypted form at the server and accessible. So that's the big difference.
Oh, that clarifies it. That certainly does. So to the august panel, so far we've looked at the threat landscape, we've looked at the components of the basic elements that determine what zero trust is. But to many in the audience, this is a new term, and I agree with Glenn that these principles, and Ed also mentioned it, have been in existence. But many will probably think that these zero trust systems are an esoteric, sort of academic principle. So I'd like each of you, Raluca, Ed, and Glenn, to perhaps provide for the audience some examples. Are there zero trust systems out there? And so I'll start with you, Raluca, and then go to Ed and Glenn and ask for, practical examples of such systems. So share with us what you know, Raluca.
Sure, yeah. So, we academics have been preaching about this central, no central point of attack, which is the same thing as zero trust for decades. But happily, fortunately, lately, industry has been adopting zero trust much more rapidly, and there's really a rising wave. It's very, very exciting. I would say that, WhatsApp was a very, very big step towards zero trust when they brought end-to-end encryption to billions of users for chat. That was, I would say, a huge landmark. Also, Signal is another company that provides chat and end-to-end encrypted chat that is widely used. Now, on the enterprise setting, on the enterprise side of things, because those were consumer side products, on the enterprise side for file sharing and emails, the leading solution is PreVeil, and PreVeil implements what I discussed, cryptographic keys for passwords, end-to-end encryption, and basically zero trust for administrators. Another recent one that I think is exciting is the fact that Zoom added end-to-end encryption to video communications, which is also another very important step because so many sensitive communications are going on online right now in this area of remote work.
So, Ed and Glenn, any color that you'd like to add on, how the agencies and the defense establishment look at, zero trust systems? I mean, from the outside, we know you've got classified systems, etc. Could you shed some light on practical systems and how they're used?
Sanjay, I have to answer maybe a little bit different, which is, so these systems are starting to emerge, but as all things in government, there's cost involved, right? But I often find when you get in these debates over cost, I think Wall Street Journal did a fantastic job here recently trying to put a dollar figure on a hack, and they came up with, over $3 million per. If you start to look at that, so you can either continue to reinforce what we're doing, or as you rightly laid out in the beginning, or I think it was Glenn rather, this attack surface is growing. It's growing exponentially. And so if we don't start moving now to this and recognizing it's not just forward funding, but it's risk avoidance, and especially for defense, right? Coming from, 2nd Infantry Division, combat brigades, you name the operational commander out there, he or she wants to know that their data can be trusted. And so I think it's an imperative that we start moving in this direction as fast as possible, especially given what our potential adversaries have been doing over the last 2 years, demonstrating what's possible against our current systems.
Let me build on what Raluca and Ed just said and point out the obvious that, our cyber architecture is so extraordinarily complicated, and the nature of the internet, perhaps because of the way it was designed and its original founding principles, is such that it's just extraordinarily complex. And you might say that's a bad thing and leads to cyber insecurity. But the flip side of that is that it could also lead to cyber greater security, because there's no one solution, there's no one magic bullet, no miracle drug that's going to solve the problem. It's everything from such things as end-to-end encryption, zero trust principles, resilience, redundancy, et cetera. So there's a wide range of tools we have at our disposal to make our cyber lives a little better. And we certainly see zero trust principles employed not only in such places as classified networks in the US government, but even in ordinary computer systems run by large corporations, which have maybe not a zero trust architecture throughout their entire enterprise, but pieces of it. So for example, there, as we just saw in the SolarWinds hack, we saw a number of corporations who were indeed penetrated apparently by the Russians, but because of a zero trust principle, the attacker wasn't able to either escalate and get into higher level computers or go laterally into other systems connected to the original one they penetrated. And that's basically a zero trust system at work, which is taking a look at every transaction, seeing whether it's authentic and authorized and appropriate, and recognizing that authority should or permission, so to speak, in a computer system should be pushed down to the lowest level. So there are some benefits to that. I do want to talk for a second, Sanjeev, if I may, about some of the negatives or risks, because I want people to understand that zero trust architecture, as I think is apparent, is not just a piece of software you buy. It's not an architecture. It's not a specially configured server that you go get as opposed to a different one. It's a complex set of principles and guidelines that have to be applied consistently throughout every step of a network and an architecture, from the initial design through changes. And that really is the problem, which is to say, for companies now shifting more to this mode and away from the traditional firewall concept and reliance on firewalls, this is incredibly difficult. They have many, many systems. It's very hard to retrofit this in some areas. Think of the military, which has lots of legacy weapon systems, some of which are using old Windows programs and God knows what else. So implementing a zero trust system and guidance throughout an entire enterprise is a really complex and expensive thing. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, doesn't mean you shouldn't start and get on it, but we should recognize that it's going to be a process. And then secondly, as has been hinted at, while such things as end-to-end encryption and zero trust principles will greatly improve our cyber insecure lives and make it much harder for adversaries, it's not the end of the question. A so-called DDoS attack, a denial of service attack, can still cripple or compromise a network, especially if it's aimed at the very part of the network that controls the zero trust architecture. So we could see a sophisticated attack still sort of undoing some of these benefits, hopefully not. It'd be a lot harder in the encrypted end-to-end email systems that Sanjeev and Raluca were talking about, for such as PreVeil and others. But nonetheless, there are still points of vulnerability. And of course, it's always the case that someone could have a compromised account and get in and still wreak some mischief before they're caught. So I think we need to approach it with a level of humility, but also recognizing that it can be a major benefit.
I think you've said it so well, Glenn, that, we ought to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of these systems. And certainly, by no means is a system that is designed on zero trust principles invulnerable. I mean, but it basically does elevate the security in such a manner that it makes it extraordinarily hard to go hit servers and admins and passwords. One of the things that I'd like to follow up on and perhaps add a little color is that, you rightly pointed out that, there's a lot of legacy systems out there, and deployability, making it easy to deploy, is one of the key considerations. And I suspect that Signal is a great example, as is WhatsApp. I mean, they were easy systems to deploy because it took a couple of minutes and you deployed it on your mobile phone and you were able to move on. And I'd like to think that, PreVeil takes this very similar approach to make the system easy to deploy. So in our case, our electronic mail and file sharing systems are a simple overlay over existing Gmail and O365 systems in a manner that we don't touch the existing systems. And so the deployment makes it easy. Let me ask Raluca one more question. Does a zero trust system mean it's a complicated system from an end user perspective to use? I'm aware of your research on usable encryption. So speak a little bit to the usability of these systems, and your comments would be very welcome, I think, to the audience here.
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, even though the notion of end-to-end encryption and zero trust exists in academia for a while, the biggest challenge was how to make these systems easy to use. So that's why it took a number of years to get to where we are today, where these systems are actually very easy to use, because there's a conflict between making them easy to use and keeping their high level of security. So I think that today, in existing systems today, such as PreVeil and WhatsApp, we actually have resolved these issues. Think of WhatsApp. Is it easy to use? I would say it's very easy to use, and it provides end-to-end encryption. Similarly, with PreVeil, it doesn't change the workflow of regular email and file sharing. So I would say that today, end-to-end encryption systems, zero trust systems can be as easy to use as regular systems, although that wasn't the case 10 years ago. So I think this is the huge opportunity we have today to adopt these systems.
Appreciate it. I mean, I use WhatsApp and Signal all the time, and appreciate the attention to detail that they have put into the systems. And certainly I can obviously, with all my biases, think about PreVeil as well. Moving on back to Glenn and Ed. The audience is very keen to ask you lots of questions, but I have one summary question for you. Could you summarize, opportunities and challenges to the adoption of zero trust systems, both in the government and in the private sector, before we move to questions from the audience?
First, Sanjeev, I think you hit on the first one, which is it has to be easy to use. Second is it has to take on legacy systems as well as going forward, because there's just so much out there in the Defense Department, but as important in the defense industrial base, as we talked about. I mean, the theft of intellectual property and trade secrets has been enormous over the last couple of years, and we can have the best science and technology in the world, but if we can't hang on to this, it impacts the national security of the country. So, I think in a way, the last part is there has to be a will to push it, right? The leaders have to push on this hard. Not many people that I've talked to, it's only when they get attacked and breached that all of a sudden they get serious on cybersecurity. After that point, it's always somebody else that it's going to happen to.
Absolutely.
And when it happens to you, all of a sudden you'll take action. We don't need to wait. We know, there used to be those that have been hacked and those that don't realize they're going to get hacked, right? That's sort of a mentality. And to get on top of this right away, this is a pretty fast solution to bring a much higher level of security fast. It's not It's not a 100% solution. Clearly, you alluded to electronic warfare, all kinds of things like this also impact our communications in the military. But in terms of security of data, this we have no time to waste.
Glenn, any concluding thoughts? I know you've spoken a lot about, the challenges, particularly even in the private sector, to the adoption of such systems, and often the perception that the private sector will do it, but not the government, and so forth. So your thoughts on it?
Sure. I think you and Ed and Reluca have largely covered it. So I'm not sure how much there is to add, but just from the perspective of someone who spent many years in the private sector, I want to emphasize just how important it is for the decision to shift from legacy systems and firewalls and focusing on ever more secure passwords that are changed every week, et cetera, and moving to this different kind of thinking, zero trust, end-to-end encryption, et cetera, is really something that has to start from the top of an organization and work all the way down. It's not simply a question for the board of directors of a corporation to just issue an order to the chief information security officer saying, please implement zero trust next Thursday and give us a report. This is incredibly complicated because it pervades the every single aspect of a network and all of the many users on a network. It requires revamping over time, obviously not going to happen quickly, revamping the fundamental way something is looked at and analyzed and thought about. So it's quite a task. And if you say, well, gee, isn't that time consuming and expensive? The answer, to be fair, is yes. And my response to that is, well, what's the alternative? One cyber breach will more than pay for all the costs that you could have, that you would have had to expend on this, on fixing it right. It's sort of like after a fire, complaining about the cost of the fire damage and recognizing that had you had fire insurance, you would have been way better off because the premiums are far lower than the damage you suffered. And that's true in this case too. So it is something that's worthwhile to do. The cost benefit ratio makes sense for both the Defense Department and defense contractors as well as the private sector. And I think it is long-term going to be our future in this area.
Well, I think you made an interesting point, actually, Glenn, on the question of cost. And it's ironical that the leading zero trust systems in the world are free. So, anybody can actually go and download and use Signal and WhatsApp and even PreVeil. I mean, our electronic mail and file sharing systems have a freemium, model. So it's sort of interesting that thanks to the improvements in cloud computing, primarily that have driven this, it turns out it's not as much of a hard trade-off on economics as one would like to think. There's certainly obviously a cost when you do these things with enterprises. Well, I want to thank you all for setting the stage for and answering, some interesting questions on zero trust. I'd like to now hand it over to the audience and take questions from the audience. So if the audience has any key questions, we would be happy to go and take them. So the first question that is coming, I think, is from Andrew Hoover, who's saying, what are one or two practices that could be added to CMMC to move towards zero trust? Is there a low-hanging fruit that could or should be added? And perhaps I might want to take the first shot at answering that. So Andrew, we believe that the easiest way to incorporate zero trust more explicitly into CMMC is through the adding of end-to-end encryption into the system. And in fact, the easier way to do it, and we have advocated for it, is to use reciprocity with the State Department's posture on zero trust systems through end-to-end encryption. Let me elaborate on that. So at the beginning of last year, the State Department, again, working with the National Security Agency, came up with a position on how Itar data, which is again, controlled but unclassified, but very sensitive. How should Itar data be used in a cloud system? And the guidance was very clear. So the State Department came up with regulation, and that's the law of the land right now, that if you're using a cloud system and the cloud system is using, number one, end-to-end encryption, number two, it's using FIPS 140-2 algorithms to encrypt the information, and number three, that the provider of the cloud system has no ability to go and access any network decryption codes, etc., so that they can decrypt the Itar data, then such data can be sent and shared over using the cloud system with end-to-end encryption. And so one way in which CMMC can more explicitly adopt this is perhaps to have some reciprocity or adopt the same principles, because that's what is state of the art. And I have some understanding that, the head of the CMMC program, Ms. Katie Arrington, has made zero trust and defense industrial base supply chain security one of her top priorities. So I would suppose that, for them, this would be one means to go and incorporate that. I hope that's helpful to you. Any other questions? Is the Biden administration interested in zero trust and inserting it into the rulemaking? I do not know that, and I think I would defer to Glenn and others, because I don't think President Biden calls me and asks for my opinion on this matter, but I presume he probably does call Glenn. So Glenn, over to you.
Well, he doesn't call me either, but I am in touch with many friends in the administration, and I can tell you that the Biden administration is very focused on cybersecurity. Obviously, people such as Ann Neuberger on the National Security Council staff is working with private industry now to look at lessons learned from SolarWinds. I'm confident that the incoming head of CISA and the new National Cyber Policy Director, both of whose nominations were just announced today, I'm confident that all of them will be taking a sharp look at what kind of improvements we need to make in our national cyber posture. And although I have no particular inside knowledge, it's hard for me to imagine that zero trust will not be one of the core principles.
Nick Grogan asks, where is ZTA or zero trust architecture represented in CMMC? And again, I would say that based on my understanding, it isn't specifically called out, but the architectural principles of zero trust, specifically those relying on encryption, are all over the CMMC, program. And I do have to say that, again, PreVeil has a voice in this, and we're very happy to share that the very first client of PreVeil that was recently audited by DIBCAC had installed a PreVeil system as an overlay to an Office 365 system, and it was responding to the CMMC provisions. And the audit, which was a very rigorous audit, I understand 5 auditors from DIBCAC audited them, resulted in 106 to 108 out of 110 score, so near perfect score. So again, the use of these encryption principles, the use of principles of not trusting passwords for authentication, the distributing the trust between administrators, are all sort of asked for in different ways, shapes, and forms, not specifically in the way in which Raluca described them, but the concepts obviously are there that you need to protect admins, you need to protect servers, you need to protect authentication and so forth. And the results have been great. But we would hope that the powers that be are listening, and in further updates to the CMMC program, the guidance of the NSA is more closely adhered to.
If I could, Sanjeev, I just want to add one thing you just said. So when you look through all, I'll just use the NIST 172 as an example. A lot of it's a maturity model, but some of the steps in there are actually solved technologically by getting rid of, for example, the key server. Now all of a sudden that's no longer required. and that just drops that whole piece out. So zero trust over time, I expect something will evolve here, but it's a different way of doing things. And so I expect to see something in the future that will better address this as we continue to learn more. Considering where CMC started and where it is today has really been good news.
Yeah.
Ed, that's a great, segue into a question that I've been always dying to ask Raluca. And, oftentimes people, rely on so-called key servers, and they say, well, I'm using encryption and I have a great key server. And Raluca, I've often heard you in public comments speak to the notion of key servers being themselves a central point of attack. Could you elaborate a little bit on this counterintuitive notion that a key server is actually a security vulnerability?
Exactly. So a bunch of solutions that claim to have end-to-end encryption, they also have the keys stored on the server. And that's for convenience, and that's because, in some cases you need more technological advances to support processing at the same time with encryption. The problem with that, though, is that an attacker who breaks in the server, they can take not just the encrypted data, they can take the keys as well and decrypt the data. So in some sense, having the keys and the encrypted data at the server is dangerous because the attacker can decrypt the data. The fact that they're segregated into two different pieces means that, okay, the attacker has to do a bit more work, but we know that attackers eventually break in and they can get access to the keys and the encrypted data and decrypt the data.
Well, thank you for clarifying. Now that's always been one of those sort of misperceptions, and thank you for clarifying. The very last question I will be putting before you is coming from Shama Hussain. She asks, the discussion didn't involve the people aspect of investing in people, as the solutions fail if investments in employees aren't done. So Glenn and Ed, your thoughts on, the people aspect. How do, for example, the agencies, et cetera, deal with training folks on the use of these more advanced, systems?
Well, I'll just jump in and make the quick point that even though we're talking about computer systems and software and the principles for all of these, at the end of the day, it's all about people, right? It's people communicating, it's people sitting at keyboards. And so there's no question that any approach using a zero trust architecture and of trying to implement those principles has to have as its foundation clear communications to a workforce and to the users in a network. And so it's going to be really incumbent on anyone, whether it's in the private sector or the defense industrial base or the Department of Defense itself, to make sure we have cyber literate citizens and users. So that's just got to be a key part of it to understand their responsibilities in this area. So there's no question that is an important part. And indeed, one of the challenges we're going to face over the next decade or so is making sure that our nation has enough people who are cyber savvy to fill the roles that our industry is going to be demanding. That's going to be a big challenge for us.
Well, I think, thank you so very much. This brings to conclusion this, extraordinary hour where we were able to gather this truly exceptional, panel. I'd like to thank you, Raluca, Glenn, and Ed, for your participation. There were a lot of questions that were asked about PreVeil. I'll simply, make this small paid political announcement that PreVeil's an end-to-end encrypted email and file sharing system. It is a simple overlay to your Office 365 and Google environments. You can use your same email address, send emails from the existing, applications. And the file sharing system is fully integrated with your PC and Mac file systems available on the mobile devices. PreVeil's FedRAMP moderate system supports FIPS 140 encryption and stores all its data on AWS High GovCloud. If folks need more information about the system, Please feel free to reach us through info@preveil.com or through our website. We appreciate your participation in the webinar today. And again, thank you so very much to our panelists.